Okay, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Lawrence Fu. I'm a faculty member at CHIBI, the Center for Health Informatics and Bioinformatics. Today I will be talking about machine learning models for predicting the impact of biomedical articles. So before I start jumping into the specific applications, I wanted to sort of just focus on the big picture, talk about the general problem we're going to be discussing. And that problem is that the scientific literature, it's large, it's complicated, and it's growing every year. If you look at this figure, it tracks the number of Medline articles published every year. It stops at 2010, but now there's at least 1 million articles every year added to PubMed. So then the problem is, how do we find high-quality articles in this large mass of literature? Now, the most popular way people evaluate quality now is citation counts. They just count the number of citations. Another way people identify high-quality articles is using Boolean query filters, meaning if a certain combination of terms appear in the title and abstract, consider that a high-quality article. So then the purpose of the two applications I'm going to be talking about is to develop more sophisticated methods for identifying high-quality articles. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about machine learning methods, and they're especially relevant today with the increasing amount of electronic data that's available for us. So if we have more data available, we should take advantage of this in identifying high-quality articles. So this link I've included in this image come from a recent announcement from Elsevier, which they've opened up their articles to allowing researchers text mine. So I'm not familiar with all the specifics, but the example they give is in articles, suppose a certain gene or sequence is included. If you're able to extract that information, then you could link to other articles and identify the relationships between them. So instead of relying on a simple metric such as citation count, we should leverage this additional information while searching the literature. And that's the main motivation behind the work I'm going to be talking about. So this talk is going to be split into two halves. The first half is going to be focusing on citation count as the measure of quality. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about predicting whether or not an article will receive greater than a certain number of citations. The second half, I'm going to be using translational success as the measure of quality. Now, for the purposes of this talk, when I say translational success or translational impact, what I mean is that some type of basic science discovery has impacted clinical care. And the way I'm going to interpret that is if something is cited by a clinical trial or a clinical guideline. So that's what I'm talking about when I say translational success. Obviously, you can define it a number of other ways, but that's the operational definition I'm going to be using. Now, another goal of this talk is to present the basics of text categorization for you. Both of these applications I'm talking about, I framed as a text categorization task. So as I'm explaining these applications, I'm going to be discussing the various steps in text categorization and explaining the various considerations in each step. Now, text categorization, you can think of as a classification task using text data. When I say classification, I mean you have a set of items and you want to produce some type of output or label for them. So for our purposes today, the items are going to be text documents, and all the features and terms inside of those are going to be the inputs. And then the output would be whether or not an article is high quality. So when I'm talking about citation counts, when I say high quality, I mean it's received a certain number of citations. And just in general, the way text categorization works is you have a set of documents. You know what those labels are. You train a model on those articles. And then you apply that model to another set of articles, which were not used in training, and you get a set of labels for those documents. So that's just sort of the general framework. So first, I'm going to talk about predicting citation count. Citation count is a very popular metric where the intuition is that higher quality papers will receive more citations. It's popular because it's simple, it's intuitive, and it makes sense to people. The major limitation of citation count is that you must wait for these citations to accumulate. So when a paper is published, you can't use citation count to tell you which papers are high quality because you have to wait for those to accumulate over time. So then the question is, can we predict citation counts using only information available at the time of publication using machine learning methods and the text categorization approach that I'm going to be talking about. The main benefits are accelerating research. If you could tell researchers earlier on that these papers are high quality, then they could focus on those more quickly. Another one is we could improve our understanding of what leads to highly cited papers. And also a practical application is we could improve PubMed search. Now when you do a PubMed search, you can sort based on date, author, journal, those types of things. But if you could give a measure of the anticipated impact, meaning this paper is likely to be highly cited, that would be useful to people. So when you talk about text categorization, there are a number of key steps that you need to figure out. The first one is building a training corpus. Now this is a key step because if you don't include the correct features or you format them incorrectly, it can lead to very poor performance. So obviously you want to include features that have a relationship or a predictive of the label or the class you're trying to predict. For this application with predicting citation counts, I focused on internal medicine articles from 6 well-known journals, such as JAMA, BMJ, New England Journal of Medicine. And for each of those articles, I extracted these features. So these are going to be the basis of the training. There was 2 types of features I included. The ones highlighted in gray are content. Those come from the title, the abstract, the mesh terms. And the features in blue, those are bibliometric features. You can consider those as metadata, other information about the authors, the journal, the publication, that give information about the quality of the articles. And the training is performed on a combination of those 2 types of features. Then the actual response variable, the class, is based on the citation count. So for this learning task, I converted the citation count into a binary label. So I had a number of thresholds, 20, 50, and 100, meaning I was trying to predict whether or not an article would receive this number of citations. So would an article receive more than 20 citations or more than 50 citations? And then the next step is to convert the documents into a format for learning. So initially when you collect the corpus, you have a bunch of text documents. You need to convert them into numerical values that the training method can input. So common steps are to first remove stop words. Those are words that are not very informative, such as a, the, those types of words. Another step is to stem the words. That means you convert multiple forms of the same word down to its base form. And then you also weight the words. That means you convert it to a weight based on how frequently it appears in either the text in the document or the entire corpus. So then at the end, after all this pre-processing, you're left with a matrix of values between 0 and 1, where the rows are the articles, and then the columns are the features. And that is the actual input for the training. Now, to train the models, you want to use a classifier or a method that is suited to your learning task and also the data. So since we're dealing with text data, we want a method that can handle high-dimensional data as well as sparse data, which is common for text. High-dimensional data means there's a lot of features, and sparse data means most features only appear in a small number of documents. And the learning method I use is support vector machines, or SVMs, which have been shown to do well in text categorization. Now, the next step is how you actually perform model selection or training of the models. So for this process, you need to optimize parameters, estimate the error, evaluate the performance, and make sure you're not overfitting, meaning giving you unrealistically optimistic estimates of the performance. Typical way of doing this is nested cross-validation, and I also used AUC as the evaluation metric. So then, here are the results that were produced after the training. So the 4 models showed that it was actually possible to predict, using only information available at the time of publication, to predict the long-term citation counts for articles. So for the 4 different thresholds, 20, 50, 100, and 500, all of the AUC values were greater than 0.86. So just to remind you, AUC values of 0.75 are considered mediocre, 0.85 is very good, and 0.9 is excellent. So all of the values were very good to excellent. Now this result was very, very exciting because when I first performed this work, a lot of the other methods used short-term information, meaning they waited a couple months after an article was published and used that information to predict the long-term citation count. So obviously, it's a much more difficult task if you predict before you have any information after publication. So then the next step I performed was to try to analyze the features and figure out which ones were more important. So the first thing I did was train models on only subsets of the features. So I trained a model on just the content features and also a model just on the bibliometric features. And what I found out was that one type of feature wasn't necessarily more important than the other. You needed both types of features for maximal performance. As you can see here, when you look at just the black and the gray bars, meaning the content and the bibliometric features, one doesn't necessarily dominate the other. And then the next step I performed was to try to identify individual features that were important. So what I did was I performed feature selection by learning the Markov blanket to come up with a smaller subset of important features and then perform logistic regression on them to identify which ones of those were most important. So in terms of the bibliometric features, the author citation counts and the impact factor were important regardless of the citation threshold. That means of all the models, those were consistently important. Now, there was no content feature that was important for all of them. But it's important to note that at least the citation information and the impact factor were consistently important. So now I'm going to be talking about predicting translational impact. So just a little bit of background, I'm just going to discuss translational research, the process, which everyone knows it's a lengthy and costly process. Often cited number is that the amount of time it takes from drug discovery to reaching market is 13 years, costs $1 billion, and involves 95% failures. And if you factor in the actual time to sort of disseminate that knowledge and have it roll out into clinical care, that's another 4 years. So that's 17 years total for the translational process. Now, what this feature is, or this image is representing is that if you look at the actual endpoint, say like a clinical trial or a clinical guideline, you sort of follow the citation path backward to try to identify which papers have influenced it or impacted it. The actual number of papers is very small. So then the question is, can we identify earlier on what these important papers are? So that's the sort of motivation of this next section I'm going to be talking about. So I'm also going to review a couple areas of the literature which focus on trying to model translational research and try to analyze it to improve our understanding of the process, because it's a poorly understood process. The first literature I'm going to be talking about is the process marker model. And what the process marker model does is it designates a number of endpoints or milestones throughout the translational research process. So one example is at the point when individual clinical trials are synthesized into systematic reviews or meta-analyses. That would be at the point when it goes from the clinical trial system to practice research system. So this marker model is it's more of a conceptual framework, and it sort of gives you, some intuition. If you wanted to measure the amount of time between certain milestones, you could look at the differences in the publication dates. So like I said, it provides a conceptual framework and doesn't really provide a practical method if you wanted to, in fact, identify or predict articles that would lead to translational impact. The next two areas of literature I'm going to talk about sort of focus on evaluating the efficiency of research, trying to determine if resources are allocated efficiently. With the payback model literature, it focuses on quantifying the outputs of research. So it looks at things like, for a certain grant, how many publications were produced from it, how many other grants were acquired from it, or how many graduate students were funded, those types of things. And with the Comroe-Drips paper and other papers it motivated, it wanted to evaluate the relative contribution of basic science versus clinical research for translational science. Now, the limitation of these two literatures is that they relied on case studies and manual review, so they're not exactly generalizable. So whatever results or findings that they had focused on a small number of topics, and you can't necessarily scale those to cover all topics or all areas of medicine. Which leads me to the work I'm going to be talking about with predicting translational impact. So the question is, can we predict which papers are going to be cited by a clinical trial, clinical guideline, using the machine learning methods, the text categorization approach I'm talking about? Now, obviously, the main benefit is that machine learning models provide an automated method. So you could analyze thousands of articles and apply those to thousands of articles, which is not possible if you're relying on manual review of the literature. So the first step is considering how difficult this task is. Obviously, this is more difficult than predicting citation counts. We're talking about more and more topics over longer and longer time periods. If you're talking about a guideline and looking back in time over multiple citations, this path is indirect. So it may not even be possible trying to predict whether or not something will lead to translational success. So the first step I did was to try to come up with a well-defined, small, manageable task to first demonstrate the feasibility of this approach. So the first step I did was to define a number of states of translational progress. So for instance, one state is the initial basic science discovery, the discovery of a gene, a target. And then the actual, the end goal is the translational success. Is it cited by a guideline? Now, a number of other states could be stalled research. If you think of research happening over a number of years where papers are being published, but it's not clear yet if that's going to lead to success. Another possible state is waiting state, where progress is being made, but another discovery in a related field is necessary before actual success happens. Now, this list of states I've come up with is not meant to be an exhaustive, complete list. It's just some context to explain how I was thinking about it. And also, I'm not trying to imply that translational research is a linear process. Obviously, there's a lot of iterative processing going back, from, may go to clinical phase and then go back to basic science discovery. But this is just sort of, the framework in which I sort of first approached the problem. Now, also, the models I'm going to be talking about next focus only on the transition between initial discovery to translational success. The reason I didn't try to model the other ones are they're more difficult, they're ill-defined, and arguably the discovery to translational success is the most important of them. So that was just the first step. So another consideration, besides just formulating the task, was the actual topic of the articles or the guideline you're looking at. So as I was constructing the corpus, I defined two use cases. The first is sort of just focusing on one topic. And the topic I used was NYESO 1, and I'll explain why I chose that later on. But for the time being, the first use case was to look at all the articles about this one topic and try to predict whether or not it would be cited by a clinical trial with just that topic. So that is defining a smaller subset of articles instead of trying to look at all topics. Now, the second use case was to look at, or not restrict the topic of the article, but still look at the clinical trials about NYESO, but predict which articles from any topic would be cited by it. Now, obviously, the next step would be use case 3, where you're not restricting the topic at all. I didn't try to model that because that's much more difficult, but that is the goal, is to eventually look at all topics for all articles and all clinical trials or guidelines. So then to summarize the corpus or corpora I created, there were two of them. I first started off with a seed set of clinical trials for NYESO 1. NYESO 1 is a cancer antigen. It's a recent advancement that has led to targeted molecular treatments for cancer. It's an ideal example of translational success, while also having the benefit of being a relatively small literature. So if I need to go back and manually review these articles, it's somewhat manageable. Now, for that seed set of 31 clinical trials, I created two corpora, where the first one restricted the articles to that topic, and the second use case did not restrict that topic. So in terms of the actual learning being performed, the text categorization framework, it was very similar. The only main difference was the corpus and how it was constructed. The document preprocessing, all the weighting, those steps and procedures were performed the same way. I used the same type of learning method, SVMs, and performed model selection in the same manner. Now, the results showed that the models were able to identify which articles were cited by the clinical trials. For the two use cases I show, the AUC values were 0.87 and 0.92, which show that the models were able to differentiate the articles. And I've also included a list of the features for each of the use cases to give you some intuition of what are the features that are being used to make the classification. And they appear to be making sense. Now, so to just summarize, I provided some concrete examples for text categorization. Text categorization is a very flexible, powerful method. So I specifically demonstrated its use for two applications. One is predicting citation counts. The other one was to predict translational success or being cited by a clinical trial or clinical guideline. So in the future, there's two obvious directions I'd like to focus on. One is to explore use case 3 where the topic isn't being restricted. So looking at all articles and all clinical guidelines or clinical trials. And then also 2 is to model more fully the translational research process. So like I said, initially I focused only on the direct transition from discovery to translational success. Well, I'd like to model all the other ones to try to get a better understanding of the full process. Okay, so here are some references to some of the articles and figures. And then if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them now. Thank you.
Are there any features in your feature set that sort of capture the amount of research activity in the particular domain? For example, cancer is a very highly researched topic right now. It's a very hot topic. So a lot of people are working on it. So a higher chance of getting more citations.
Right. You're talking about for predicting citation count, correct? Yeah, well, when I showed those features, that was for 100 citations. That was for that threshold. And one of them was, I think, smoking related mesh terms. So that sort of gives you a sense, that is a topic that's associated with highly receiving a lot of citations. So, I mean, also these models were trained for a certain time period. So it may not be indicative of, other time periods. So if you wanted to, look and try to identify topics that were hot for a certain time period, then those models would have to be retrained for that time period. But,
So, when, I guess, like the content-wise, you mainly use the abstract, the word frequency sort of in the abstract to predict the citation. So, I guess in that scenario, it seems to me it is the actual research topic that made the citation high, but not like the quality of the research, sort of. Would you say so? Or is there any other, like say, high frequency word or feature in the abstract domain that contribute more to like the citation? Does that make sense?
yeah, so you're saying that for the content features, it seems that they're more important for predicting the citation count? You're saying if it's about a certain topic?
Yeah, because it seems like, so to me it seems like if a research is important or not doesn't like entirely depend on like what topic it is.
Well, but you also have to think that there's a lot of papers being published that have that content that aren't necessarily highly cited. So you have to think of it in combination with the bibliometric terms. So articles about a certain topic also written by a researcher with a lot of previous citations, a lot of previous publications from a high-ranking institution. Okay, does that help or answer your question?
I guess it's just kind of sad, the fact that...
But I'm not saying that, The results are not saying that only the content matters. Yeah, that's not what it's saying. It's just saying that if you train a model which combines all these features together, you can make, predictions. It's not saying that, just write a paper about this topic and you're going to receive a lot of citations. That's not what it's saying.